Hello and welcome. Today's lecture for English 345, this is Early American Literature, is on Bryant, Apess, Schoolcraft, and Kirkland. So we have a large number of authors for consideration today. I begin with an image called Kindred Spirits. This is a painting by Asher B. Durand. It's very easy to find online. You can simply Google Kindred Spirits painting and you will find what you're looking for. You'll also note that in the PowerPoint that I've put on the Documents section of Blackboard, you can actually click in Notes View and you'll see the notes that I'm using in order to do this lecture. Here you have in the painting Cole, another famous painter of the time, and William Cullen Bryant, our poet. Durand, your artist here, chooses to show the poet and the painter working together for a number of reasons. So you have Cole and Bryant as the men in the scene. And what he's going for is a representation not only of the two men that were the so-called spiritual fathers of Central Park, but also you have a pairing together of artists, the painter and the poet, and what should be seen as an always dual representation of how art works, a dual representation of artist with the image and the word working together. So you have the image in a direct sense from the representation of a painter by a painter. So you have Cole in this painting, but you also have your poet representative of words. So on the left you have William Cullen Bryant. He was a poet, as you know, you've read some of his poems, and the editor of the New York Evening Post. On the right, it's Thomas Cole, and Cole founded the Hudson River School of Painting. If you like art, and you like this type of art, you like art history, you should look up the Hudson River School of Painting because it's foundational to an understanding of American culture. Cole, as an artist, wanted to represent the beauty of America. So you'll see in all of his painting, you'll see landscape paintings that show the beauty in particular of the wild aspect of America, or what we might call the native beauty of the land. This presents the two men together in the Catskill Mountains, but what I think is important to bring up again, because it's a theme that we've been talking about in this course, is when you do have a representation of this so-called virgin land or untouched land, we have to recognize that in the background we should always consider that this land was taken from the indigenous people who already lived here. So at the same time that you have nature serving as an allegory for the beauty of America, the possibilities of America, and also the human condition, you also have it as a place of divine truths and as a place that wouldn't have existed for these men had it not been taken from the indigenous peoples. One of William Cullen Bryant's poems that I think speaks directly to this relationship between painting and poetry is this, the sonnet to an American painter departing for Europe. He wrote this for Cole, for Thomas Cole, that you see in the Kindred Spirits painting. You can pause on this and read it. I don't want to read through it to take up time in the video lecture, but do pause and read this. You'll see in it a number of references to images that Bryant was focusing on to specifically draw a comparison between America and Europe. This is part of a trend for emergent literary nationalism. By emergent literary nationalism, I'm talking about deliberate efforts on the part of your writers in America at this time, 1829, 1830s or so. They're picking up on themes that are going to uphold what we might call the New Republic or the early Republic after the American Revolutionary War. So we're looking at a time that we're shifting slightly past where we've been in the last few days in class. And in order to create this emergent literary nationalism in the paintings, you have the author's use of the things that you see here displayed in the bullets: perspective, perception, imagination, landscape, and the past. Where you see the past is not always particularly obvious. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. In this particular one you see here, the oxbow, you don't see much representation of the past. I don't think that he was looking to have some type of commentary on how this oxbow was formed or anything like that. I don't think it's an ecological meaning behind this, but I do see in this Thomas Cole work an effort to display some of the wilds of America that had recently been put this in quotation marks, discovered by Lewis and Clark in their 1803 expedition. So a lot of this information that people would have now available visually was very, very new. And it's something I think today that we might take for granted. In this image, it's much easier to see the historical aspect of it, that he's trying to capture a moment in American history and American culture. This one, Home in the Woods from 1847, it shows a number of things. If you look at the painting, the glowing home signifies the importance of home. You have the wilderness as a book of unread wisdom. You have a participation in this painting in a larger discourse happening nationally, showing the beauty and morality and national potential of homesteads like these. What this type of scene means in the larger context of America pushing into the West. What we consider the West, although Lewis and Clark went pretty far, was not anywhere close to what we see several years later when we see the gold rush. So we're not yet in a time when the frontier would have been out towards Nevada and Arizona and California. It's really much more in what we might consider the middle of the country now. And I think you can see that from some of the aspects in this particular painting. Here's another one that has a wilderness view mixing with man-made objects. This is another Thomas Cole work. This is earlier. This is 1825. It's called A View of Fort Putnam. In this painting of Fort Putnam, you have your figure up in the front. 1825 we're looking at. If you look at what he's wearing, it looks early America. It looks around the time of the Revolution or just after. You see the fort on the hill in the background. You see the home. You see the tree in the front that signifies a sort of ruins. And in this you have the same type of concept that you see in Bryant's poetry, which is that the art serves as a monument to national and cultural landscapes in the same way that the poems do. So you have the art and the poems as monuments to national and cultural landscapes. And again, I'm moving quickly, but you'll see a lot of what I'm talking about in the notes in the PowerPoint slide. The notes can't capture all of it, but you'll get the gist of what it is that I'm describing here. So you might actually want to have it open in notes view, and then you can add to it as I'm talking. What Bryant wrote was lyric poems. If you're in the notes view, you'll see I have some parameters there for lyric poems. The length, usually short, 50 to 60 lines, often shorter 12 to 30 lines in lyric poems, and popularized by the British Romantics that you might be familiar with from a Brit Lit class. You see a lot of sincerity in this art and in the poems, which matches up with the nationalistic view that they're seeking with this work. One of the most popular, if not the most popular poem by Bryant is Thanatopsis. And I chose this image just to work towards Thanatopsis because I think that this image has that type of timeless quality that your artist would have been looking to represent at the time. So let's take a look at Thanatopsis, arguably Bryant's most famous poem. Here you have a meditation on death. I think it's interesting to consider what a Puritan or Calvinist might think of something like this. Bryant's mother was a Calvinist, which I think is illuminating because if you take a look at the Norton Anthology's intro to Bryant, you'll see some information on that. But we have to consider when we're looking at this, his view on God and nature. So what I want to do now is I want to go to, oops, I thought I had the, do I have the whole, no, I don't have the whole thing here, I'm sorry. So I just, looks like I just grabbed a portion of the poem. So the poem is in your book, or you can pull it up. If you have room on your screen, you can pull it up next to it if you want to do that while you're watching this. What I like to do is put this up against Freneau. You could look at Freneau's poem, The Prairies. You could put it up against the Indian Burial Ground, because I think you're going to see in this Bryant poem some of the same considerations of what I'll call American mythology, which also fits very nicely with this overall course that you're taking right now. The idea of American mythology, the idea in this case that nature provides a book of wisdom which puts nature then very much in line with how the Puritans would have read the Bible. And I can't emphasize that enough, that you see a very distinct turn in Bryant's poetry towards what I'll call proto-transcendentalism, working towards the ideas of Emerson and Thoreau, among others, working towards the idea that in order to access God, people do so through nature. So once again, realize that's a turn away from accessing God through reason, as you see in your Enlightenment thinkers, and the book of the Bible, as you would have seen in the Puritan works. So to say that once again, because it's a large but critical concept to this course, you see with something like Thanatopsis the beginnings of a turn towards people accessing the idea of God through nature, not through reason as you'd have with Enlightenment thinkers, and not through the Bible as you would with Puritans. This is not to say that Bryant and people in this time period would have just cast the Bible aside. We're looking at a particular strain of intellectual thought with a select group of thinkers. Here are some discussion questions for Bryant's poetry. You can use any of these. If not, we'll just pause on this for consideration. Where do you see an understanding of bygone nations or something else? What's Bryant's intention? What marks these poems as America? Especially when you see a pretext to American mythology here, an ancient, heroic, or tragic condition. With that idea of tragic tradition or tragic condition, I think I just said, oops, I don't know, let me go back one. If I can blow this up, if you see where I'm swirling right here, very hard to see on this screen, but if you want to pull up this poem separately, it's called The Falls of the Catterskill. And if you probably just Google Thomas Cole and the Catskills, this will come up. One of his most famous paintings. Right here, there's an Indian on this rock. And around this time in American literature and painting, a lot of your artists and writers, which to me, I call them both artists here, began to focus on images of an individual Indian, which is called the vanishing Indian trope. The vanishing Indian trope, or the trope of the vanishing Indian, is romantic in the sense that there's a nostalgia for what is perceived by people around this time in art as a loss, a vanishing part of America that can never be regained. You can get that idea together with this question over here, American mythology. So even though what happened with American Indians is largely in part due to the disease and the warfare, the violence brought by the Europeans, in this time in art you start to see a sadness and nostalgia for the loss. This dovetails nicely with Apess's work that you read. He was a Christian preacher related to King Philip from the Pequod Wars. That was the war where Mary Rowlandson was taken captive, but Apess was a Wampanoag. So if you end up taking the American drama class, we read a play called Metamora, which is subtitled The Last of the Wampanoags. Apess was a missionary and reformer of American Indian people. He wrote to address and consider a white audience, and at the same time that he did that, he criticizes the very audience he addresses. This is an Apess portrait from the frontispiece of Son of the Forest, A Son of the Forest from 1831. In it you can see that Apess arguably might have some physical features from American Indians, although that's hard to say exactly. It's an artist's interpretation. But like Equiano, what you can see is the dress of a relatively well-to-do person adopting the clothing from your people in power, which of course would have been your white Anglo-European, now American people. Apess offers conversion narratives. He tells the way he adopted Christianity and how he chose the Methodist Church. He references heathens when writing, talking about heathens as those who scoff in the house of God and at his services. So his use of heathens here extends what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago with the Indians as those who copied rituals from God. The questioning of the word heathen, here I'm questioning it the way Apess uses it because it's a little different from what we saw from the Puritans. In Apess, you see his dual identity. This is affecting his credibility, promoting it really, his ethos. It looks like a traditional conversion narrative when you read A Son of the Forest. And I'm curious, as a thinking question or question you might undertake in your blog, how is his narrative different from Puritan conversion narratives, especially compared to the Jeremiad? How does his experience as a Native American alter the narrative? I want to consider also the trope of a mirror as mediating between two cultural value systems, looking in two different mirrors, two different worldviews, two languages, two semiotic systems, two ways of communicating, oral and written. Apess uses the image of the looking glass, the Indian's looking glass for the white man. Mirrors here are rhetorical, metaphorical, and historical. We have to consider the self-reflexivity in this. Apess looking at himself as a looking glass. How does this trope work? You have the Indians as others, you have racialized difference, you have the concept of a mirror, something that you can both look in and look out from. And what I mean by that is if you're looking in a mirror, you can also see what's reflected behind you. One of my favorite parts in Looking Glass is the discussion of Jesus and the apostles as brown. I'm hoping you picked up on that when you were reading it. This discussion of mirrors brings me to a larger topic of the idea of how history is written or how history gets written. How does history get told in these European versus American concepts of history? We have oral and written traditions. We have deliberate choices that are being made. I even want to talk about the one I put on this slide. This is a romantic image that captures a sense of history but also gives it an authority. It looks like an archival image. It's a beautifully done photograph. It's very much constructed. I chose it for this PowerPoint slide in the same way that a lot of your authors and your artists would have chosen images to show what they wanted to represent. When we're looking at how history gets told, we often romanticize it. So we have to consider what are the things that Apess wants to do as a writer to reflect his history and his version of American history. So with that in mind, I have these discussion questions for Apess. I'd like you just to pause and take a look at these. I don't want to read them all for the sake of the time factor, but do take a look at this. Before I switch to Schoolcraft, this is Jane Johnston Schoolcraft. She's what we call a recovered poet. Recovery is a term that's used when scholars recover, meaning they find and they bring back to light a writer who has been forgotten. So recovered writers, usually when we're talking about recovery, we're talking about women. It doesn't always have to do with women, but generally your discourse about recovery does have to do with women writers. She's a recovered poet, so her work would have been discovered in archival material or maybe even on an old library shelf or in a collection. And then several scholars began to promote her work, and then she ends up somewhere like the anthology. We've talked about this before in class. She was a translator of Ojibwe. She works cultural and geographic borders. She herself has a mixed heritage. And at the time, the Great Lakes region where she's writing and working out of would have been the American frontier. So again, what we have is what might otherwise to us not be an obvious frontier, because we tend to think of farther west. But your identity mixing, your American frontier, your traditions that were on the edge of the frontier would have been in the Great Lakes region around this time. She was called the Northern Pocahontas, which is really crazy and ridiculous if you think about what we've talked about in this class about Pocahontas, but in popular discourse, Pocahontas was already a myth. This is that image again, Thomas Cole's Catskill Falls or Catterskill Falls. I think that this idea of the noble savage, I brought it up earlier as the vanishing Indian, but the vanishing Indian trope overlaps with the noble savage. And this gives us some context for how we read Schoolcraft's work. There you can see the Indian much clearer. So in the context of this romanticized nostalgia for Indians, we have the two tropes I've mentioned, the vanishing Indian and the noble savage. This is Rousseau again, and the Rousseau's idea of romantic primitivism and the noble savage. Rousseau praises these newly discovered savage, quotation marks, tribes as having a simpler life than the Europeans, closer to a state of nature, but for Rousseau it's a little bit oversimplified to say that they're in a state of nature that he would want all quote-unquote civilized people to be in. He's not going to go that far. What he is saying is that this noble savage is naturally good and free from the vices that plague civil society. So he's not just saying, all right, if you're an Indian, you're good, and if you're in civilization, you're bad. That's too simple, but I like to begin with the large concept because it's easiest for us just to begin to grasp the idea. There's a consideration of the American Indians as noble savages, meaning in a more pure state than those corrupted by civilization. But just realize as I say that I'm painting with a very broad brush and very much simplifying Rousseau. In a survey class like this, unless we spent a large amount of time on Rousseau and this idea, we won't be able to tease out all the smaller implications. But I'd say for an understanding for this class, we should recognize that humans in nature, in their more natural state, are closer to the blank slate idea than just saying this is the most pure form of human beings. So think of your American Indians or noble savage view more as a consideration of a blank slate, as in the tabula rasa of Locke, than in just a simple equation of natural equals good, civilized equals corrupt. I will tell you, and you'll see this in the notes, if you have the notes view pulled up, that reductionist view I've been talking about, warning about, and using at the same time was perpetuated by scholars after Rousseau. So it's not Rousseau's fault or anybody's really that we have this simplified view of the noble savage. I want to take a look at Schoolcraft's Sweet Willie. With Sweet Willie, we have sort of the East mixing with the oral tradition of the West, or what we'd now call the Midwest. You can see that easily in these opening lines. There's a mixing of discourses, of languages. This is an elegy. You might compare it to Anne Bradstreet's ones on the death of her grandchildren. Schoolcraft wrote this 8 years after her son died, and most Schoolcraft scholars don't think she knew Bradstreet's work. One question to entertain is, would you have known this was written by a Native American woman reading it? I'd also like to take a look at The Little Spirit. This takes on a tradition called the chanson de geste, which is a song of conquests and deeds. And I think there's a neat tie-in here to superheroes that you might be able to tease out. Muis, the Indian coquette, follows up nicely on the coquette that we've looked at in class. The idea of seduction. Here we have the Indian coquette, which is again a hybrid type of construction. And one thing to understand reading it, if you feel just dropped into the characters, that's because the way storytelling would have happened in the American Indian, in the populations, the way the storytelling would have happened is the characters would have already been known. So the native qualities of the heroes and heroines would have already been understood by her audiences. And they're a little bit different from the heroes and heroines in the fairy tales in Western traditions. I want to take a brief look at Kirkland to end this. Kirkland is light in comparison to other works that we're reading. I'd say if you take a look at the paragraph in the middle of 169, you might want to consider, is this a candid statement of her purpose, a lack of purpose? Is she coy or ironic in her voice? What do you hear in her voice? How is she alike or different from other authors we've read? Her mood and tone is also interesting when she talks about in the middle of 171, I seriously advise any of my friends in that particular passage. And she compares to a piece we didn't read this summer. It's Krevker's What is an American? But you can consider what she says about Americans. What is American about what she says? What does she say about men? How does this tie to the other things that we've read? You might notice that there's an extra slide in the PowerPoint that I loaded. Ignore it. I did change the order of things. So here we have the last slide for this. Thanks for listening, and I will see you Monday.